The Best Worst Idea is a weekly podcast exploring how our worst ideas often give way to our best ideas. What's your best worst idea? Want to find out? Let's go.
You're so ugly you could be a modern art masterpiece.
You look like a blueberry.
Who's gonna take his place?
Is the answer Jesus? See this? This is my boomstick!
Welcome to the Best Worst Idea podcast. My name is Frank Hanna. I'm your host. And today, my guest is another creative mastermind. He's an LA-based photographer. He specializes in portraiture and has been working in the industry for over 15 years. His clients have included Playboy, LA Weekly, The Knitting Factory, Interscope Records, and has shot at least one of Holly Madison's calendars. His photographic work has had numerous gallery exhibits throughout the West Coast, and he even published a coffee table book that is a collection of his work with model and TV celebrity Sarah Underwood, titled Muse, a Portrait of Sarah Jean Underwood. Now he's even ventured into novel writing. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast WB Fontenot.
Hello, yeah, and thank you for having me on. It's good seeing you again.
Yeah, no problem. There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about, and probably things that you forgot you may have told me over the years, and now I'm going to bring them back up and put them in. As you might know, it's like this podcast is really about exploring creativity. So the guests that I have on, they're generally people that aren't just necessarily creative, but also explore creativity in different ways. And because of what they do, they have to adjust and do different things. And that, because to me, I think creativity is inherent in everyone. And a lot of times we end up featuring or only hearing about people who have some huge creative output or something.
Right.
But the fact is, if you're solving problems in the world, you're creative. I mean, that's my position, is that creativity is part of just this problem solving ability that we have as humans. You know, as a photographer, would you say that's your main?
Yeah, it's been kind of the backbone for my creativity. That was the first thing that I got into, and I definitely have my 10,000 hours in photography. With photography, it's a little bit different because, especially now, everything's so instantaneous, right? You get feedback immediately. It's not like, I've also ventured into painting, and that's something that you can kind of fudge with and play with over time. So the creative process can kind of mutate with the piece. With photography, you kind of have to go into it and have already worked out all of your crappy ideas previously to what you're doing that day. You know, I was thinking about, this is kind of the topic of, the best worst idea or the changing of creativity. And I think with photography especially, most of my schooling it started up in the Pacific Northwest. One of the big things there is it seems like everybody takes a picture of a girl with a sword. It's just inevitable, and it happens in like all of these different. Yeah, well, yeah, no, it's rampant. It's
it's like the kind of thing you would like paint on the side of a conversion van in the 70s or something.
Yeah, only probably not as cool.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are the ideas that I think you start with kind of in your little circle, and then you branch out from there, and you can take something like that and you can make it your own. I mean, photography is very difficult because, everybody's a photographer now. And
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's actually one of the things that is amazing to me, because technology, as far as, say, cell phones has gotten, it's almost as if there's this notion that you don't even need like a full frame camera anymore.
Right.
It's if you go onto YouTube, there's plenty of videos that's saying that DLSR is dead. So, and I don't think that necessarily means that it's all just phones, but that the majority of it now is phones, and these phones are getting. If somebody's putting the technology to use, or if somebody's working on the technology, they're working on it to put it into a phone. They don't really, there's certainly great cameras out there, but it does seem like the phone is the predominant, venue for this type of technology. So I think that's one of the questions that I kind of had in talking about photography in general, because the young generation now has no concept of this notion of putting film in a camera, taking a bunch of pictures. Like if it's a point and shoot, most people had, then when they put the film into the photomat and then a week later come back and look, they have no idea if what they shot was any good until that moment.
Right. Well, I think because I learned initially on film, actually the beginning of my professional career was on film. I always liken it to if you graded excellence in photography from like 1 to 10, right? It would take you a couple of years to kind of get to like a 4 or 5. And then you'd really have to study, the technical aspects of photography in order to get to a 7. And then you have your Avedons and your Herb Ritzes and your Helmut Newtons, your guys who are kind of creative gods that can get to that 9 and 10 level. With digital photography, you kind of skip 1 through 5. So you kind of start at a 6.
Right.
And then you can get to a 7 and an 8 with a little bit of Photoshop knowledge. But your 9 and your 10s are always going to be your 9 and your 10s. I don't care if you're shooting it with a phone, if you're shooting it with a Hasselblad, if you're shooting it with a 4x5, it doesn't matter. If that 9 and 10 isn't in you, and if you haven't worked through all of your crappy ideas and all of the things that don't work, you're never going to get there. So I guess that's the whole the cream always rises to the top. Yeah, there's a lot of 7s now.
Well, as somebody who considers himself as an amateur photographer, and I've got a DSLR, and guaranteed the pictures that are the most amazing, at least objectively, are the ones that were just like, oh, I snapped it in a second, and I didn't, like, you had maybe some idea what you were getting, and then all of a sudden, holy shit, that just came out great. And you could then try to recreate the environment. Like I took a picture of a friend up at Griffith Park at the observatory, and he was looking over towards the city, and the sun caught the back of his head and his glasses, and there was like this great sun flare as well, and it was like he had sunglasses on, and it's just like kick-ass photo. But and I didn't. The other ones weren't bad, but that was the one that was like you could frame that. It was so nice looking. Everyone loved it, but I couldn't tell you how it just happened.
Right. Well, and so you couldn't reproduce it.
No.
And that's the key is, you put something in your portfolio and you go out to get hired and someone really likes that shot and they say, this is what we want for our campaign. Well, if you don't know how to reproduce it 1,000 times with different models, different pairs of sunglasses in different locations in the city, it's...
And that's the problem solving thing, right? Because, and you can't know it unless you've solved that problem. It's kind of, as a writer, it's kind of, I try and tell people, like if you're writing a comedy, well, that comes with its set of, genre conventions and problems. Or if you're writing a thriller or a whodunit, or a romance or a rom-com, whatever it is, these all have these problems that if all you do is write indie thrillers, you may not come across those problems because they're just not a feature of that genre that you're working in. But something like what you're talking about, you have to know what environment is required for you to be able to reproduce that. Sidney Lumet, the great director, used to say, "I hate style that shows." That was a quote of his. "I hate style that shows." And it's funny, and then you think, well, what does that even mean, right? And I remember there was a TV show that was on Fox a couple years ago, and it was called Deputy.
Okay.
I think Stephen Dorff played him, and he was great, but he was the guy this is not like the leadership material. This is the guy that just goes and does what needs to be done and whatever. Now, the show itself was fine.
Okay.
The thing that drove me crazy was that every shot had some sun flare in it, some kind of light flared into the lens every scene. You do that one really effective time and it means something, but like every shot is the sun getting, you know what I mean? And I thought like, why is somebody not, I mean, this is obviously somebody's vision, but like, I just couldn't see why this was such a predominant like visual footprint of the show.
Right.
It didn't seem to
Why-
make any sense. But
Yeah, why that was the look that
like
it
less is
shows.
more, right? But
I think that anything in repetition, if you get it down to the point where you no longer have to think about it,
yeah,
then you're golden. That's not to say that there's not time for experiments too. And, there were times, especially with LA Weekly, because I would get thrown into kind of some weird things where it's like, oh, you have to go photograph this band and they're playing in the basement of one of the guys' apartments. And so you don't know what the place looks like.
yeah, it's not ideal, right?
You don't
can't-
know the power situation and you have no budget. So, I show up there with like a little 3-light pack and you try to make of it what you can and be as creative as possible. Situations like that are really fun for me because it's not in the studio, kind of your everyday boring thing.
So what you're really saying is you have to problem solve and also be creative.
100%.
Oh, there you
And,
go.
the last couple years I was shooting for the shoe company ASICS. And when I was in school, I hated product photography. It was not my thing. I really liked working with people. I felt like there was an interaction there that was exciting. But when you have a product, especially a product like a tennis shoe or a running shoe, and you've seen these every which way in all advertising. So to look at something like that and say, okay, how can I do this just a little bit differently? That is where, like the problem solving that you're talking about comes into. And one of the things that I did, one of their campaigns was I had runners wear the shoes and we just beat the hell out of them, went through mud, the shoes were destroyed. This is what a marathon runner's shoes look like after they've run. There's usually some blood on them. The cushions just pretty much failed at that point. And those runners are kind of proud of those shoes. They wear it like a badge of honor. So why not show that?
Mm-hmm.
And so I shot a big part of the campaign with the shoes just beat up and it was cool. So, and then you also have to have the beauty shots too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, some of the stuff that I did it turned into billboards for the Olympic Village, for the Olympics. And that was pretty cool seeing that. And that's just, then you're just a technician, you have 50 people telling you what they want and you kind of just hone down into exactly as specific as possible.
Yeah.
With little lighting kicks off of the shoelaces or,
Yeah, I think I remember you telling me a story that you worked with Terry Richardson at some point.
Oh,
And-
I know what you're talking about. It wasn't Terry Richardson. It was David LaChapelle.
Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's even more kind of exciting. So this idea that he's got his guys or his people that know how to set up everything exactly the way he wants it, and then he just shows up and works with the talent and does that.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting time in my life. I was photo assisting, and I was new to the professional photo scene, and to see this photographer, and LaChapelle was one of those guys that I saw his stuff in Rolling Stone, and it really made me want to be a photographer. And then to show up and to see his process where he's much more of an art director. And, good on him. He knew exactly what he wanted. But yeah, everything was done prior to him getting there. And, I look back at it now and I say, well, I'm sure he had conversations with his assistants on, what type of lighting he wanted or
like,
whatever, where they'd map
up
it
until
out.
the day, and then it's like somebody's making sure that's taken care of. And
Yeah. But, he didn't have to show up until 4 p.m.
right.
And talent got there at, 5:30 and we were ready to go. And I think there was 4 or 5 different sets. And each one we had Polaroided with 3 different lighting examples. And so he would just come in and say, I like this, I'd like this, and I like this. And then we would revert all of them to whatever lighting that was. So.
That's crazy. Sometimes you just never know what it really does take a lot of people to make somebody look great. And
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that a lot of times in this industry, people don't understand what goes behind still images.
Mhm.
And it's it is a lot more akin to motion than I think people give it credit for. The crews are pretty big, especially when you get into things that are like La Chapelle large, where you have a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, because it's not
Or-
just a portrait; it's like an entire set of things that are happening.
And there's usually a lot of stuff going on in that image. And, I tried to kind of have a similar vibe to that especially some of my kind of earlier stuff, where it looked like mass chaos, but it was a very controlled chaos.
Right.
And I knew exactly what all of the lights were doing, and I knew where people needed to be.
So let me ask you a question. So on a type of shot like that, that's kind of in that La Chapelle kind of chaotic,
Yeah.
you have this giant group of people that all seem to be living in their own story, in their own world.
Right.
All of them are pretty much tack sharp. What do they call that? Like
Hyperfocal distance. Yeah. Yeah. Hyperfocal it's a real thing.
you sometimes see focus stacking where you have different things at different places, and then you're processing the image so that everybody's in. It's kind of like the whole like dioptic lens thing that in film where they have to try and hide this shitty blurry line up the middle of the screen, but to get two people in focus that are not anywhere near.
Right, that are on different planes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done it both ways. There's some of the stuff that I've shot, I'm just far back enough. I'm using a wider lens usually. You're shooting at a pretty high aperture. And when you can do that and where you're focusing, because wherever you focus, you're getting a third in front, 2/3 behind that's your
Right.
depth of field. So if you kind of just do the math,
So
you can get
and
it.
that's really. Do you think that's also kind of where flash photography really shines, because you can't really have that kind of high aperture shot with
Right.
studio lights going? Like you need something that's going to be
You need to pump in some light.
right.
Yeah, it needs to be pretty considerable in some instances. And, for any like large group shots for, LA Weekly or even for Playboy, I did a few for Playboy.com that, they were all on different planes. And yeah, I had to crank light into them. And for things like that, we would use these lights called bi-tubes, which is you'd have two strobe heads in one light.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so you could get, two 2400 watt second packs on it. So essentially it's a 4800 watt second light. And that was crazy.
That's where the voodoo of it all comes to me, because I love available light in cameras, like where if I'm shooting something before phones, I had a lot of family members that would take pictures and they'd all put the auto flash on their cameras, and I'd walk around going, turn off this flash, turn off this flash, turn off this flash. And then they would use available light and it would be like, oh, wow, this picture's so much better. And I'm like, yeah, because you're not blowing out the entire thing, so that's kind of changed a little bit where, you can't adjust the flash on a phone, right? It just is what it is, right?
It's going to do what it's going to do.
It's really way more than just pointing and shooting. There's just so many things and one of the things as a photographer, I'm sure you've seen this, is there are times when you'll meet somebody who really that you're supposed to photograph and you'll think this person is like they're not attractive in a conventional way, or they don't look attractive, and you're thinking the camera can only do so much, right? But however, when you take a picture of them, it somehow transforms them into something else. And I'm not talking about with like fancy lighting and makeup and all that, but they're photogenic. You take their picture and then all of a sudden this other person, I've seen that happen and it just blows my mind. I can, and not everyone's like that, right? Because then there are other people that, they're beautiful, but then the camera takes a picture of them and instead of enhancing their beauty, it kind of makes them seem plastic, right? Like almost too much.
Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. And yeah, there are certain people I have photographed and it's like, man, this dude has a great mug. Like it just comes across.
Mm-hmm.
And, that goes back to, of course, you also have to know what light is going to benefit you in those in those scenarios. Yeah, back to really quick, the strobe versus just natural light.
Mm-hmm.
I love natural light as well. And it's very, well, it's hell of a lot easier. But it's also something that I find is a little bit softer at times that I like to use, when you're not shooting in, it's not noon or something like
Right.
that. Strobe lighting was one of those things that hooked me on photography. And I was going to the Art Institute of Seattle. We went outside with a little portable strobe, and it was film. So we took a Polaroid with a Hasselblad, and the sky was this kind of muddy blue. And then he was like, okay, now we're going to change the aperture and we're going to hit them with light, and we're going to expose for the light that we're hitting them for. So in essence, because the strobe's not affecting the sky, you're stopping down on the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to darken it. So he shot it and handed the Polaroid around. And the sky was this deep, dark, just gorgeous blue. And right then,
You're like, how'd you do that?
Yeah, it was that magic, right? And it was that, oh God, I can manipulate the hell out of these images. And if I can do that, then I can create my own world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, when you find you have essentially your three basic tools. You have your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed.
Mm-hmm.
And with those things, you can kind of change. And, and then on top of that, of course, back then you had your different film types. So not just black and white, but your vivid color or, your natural color. And then you could push process things.
Now we have the vibrance and the saturation slider.
Right. Well, and we also have all the filters.
Right.
And I think when you start off in photography, especially, and I think people do this in painting and other things too, is they tend to lean pretty hard on your filters or your little things that like will flip out an image to make it look cool. Like you would cross process it back in the day. And maybe that's because you don't quite know technically how to get what you're looking for. So you're just going to change the color and make it like creative and fun and weird. And that's not to say that those things can't be used really well.
Right.
Right. Like there's the Beastie Boys video that's like all fisheye lens.
Mm-hmm.
Freaking amazing. But there are a lot of people, especially in photo school, that use fisheye lenses and think it's the end all be all. And it's because they don't have an original idea for the project.
Right.
So they use it to kind of skew the thing so they can just fall on that. So now the fisheye lens is their idea, and it's not adding to it. It just is the creativity.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting too. I think there's times where you have like a wide angle lens and you're trying to get that distortion off the side. You know what I mean? It's like, it's the opposite. You don't want it to be fisheye. You're like, I want to get as much in this as I can, but now I'm getting all of this distortion on the side. Look, I've taken pictures that were fine, right? They weren't great, but then I take them into like the camera raw in Photoshop, and you start adjusting things. You start adjusting, the temperature and everything. And then you turn it into something amazing.
Yeah.
And that's great because that's what that software can do, but it's not talent.
No.
I mean, it's fine, but I mean, I realize it's like, I just kind of polished a turd in a way, right? It's like, I mean, and the pictures look great, but I had to work to try and find a way to enhance them enough so they look great. They weren't really great photos per se.
Right. It wasn't killer out of the camera.
Well, no. And if we're talking about like composition and all that, well, that's another discussion, right? But I think that what it kind of leads into is that, like you say, people can get up to a 7 now.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great things about the time we live in is that like technology is such that if somebody says, and say, well, oh, why don't you make a movie or, why don't you film something or make a little short film or something? They're like, no, I don't. Because it used to be, I can't do that because I need like a Super 8 camera, and then I need to record the audio,
right? And
then I need to get the film, and then the light, and it just was not cost effective to do that.
I mean,
and
a short's going to cost you $10,000,
right? And now you can do, oh my God, you can do so much stuff just because technology has never been easier to be able to explore, the creative part of you vis-a-vis, film and music. I mean, you name it. It has kind of created a whole subculture of mediocrity that
Yeah.
like somehow like gets, trumpeted as something more than it is.
Right.
But as somebody who says, "Hey, everyone's creative," I feel like, "Hey, good for you." You know what I mean? I think that
Yeah, and and I view things like Camera Raw and all of these are all just tools in your tool belt. I mean, it's like I was saying with you used to have different kinds of film.
right.
Well, now you have programs that can do all those films, and that's I don't want to crap on any of that. I think that if you have new tools, use them. Now, that being said, I have seen like people who want to shoot film a lot more now. Partially for the nostalgia, but then they think it's cool.
Yeah.
And I think for personal use, it makes a ton of sense. Sure, explore film. It is fun, and there is a magic to it. I mean, I remember the first time I made my first black and white print, and I saw the image come to the surface in the chemistry. I was sold. Commercially, it doesn't make a ton of sense because everything ends up digital anyway.
Right. I mean, I think if you're doing, kind of art exhibits and it's something that,
Yeah, if it never sees a computer, hell yes,
right.
I am all for it. But as soon as you, scan it or take an image of it and then you manipulate it in the computer, I don't know why you shot it on film. It doesn't make any sense to me.
So when you first started, you were at the Art Institute of Seattle, and that's where you studied photography.
Yes.
So at that point, you're photographing anything and everything, right? You're trying to just find out what it is.
Yeah, I mean, just plain.
Yeah.
And then, and then I went to a small school in Spokane, Washington. And then from there, I got accepted into Brooks Institute of Photography, which was in Santa Barbara. And I did not plan on staying at Brooks. I wanted to use their name to get an internship somewhere in LA. And that was kind of always the plan. I was at Brooks for about a quarter and just started writing emails to people continuously. And one of the places I wrote was Playboy. And I wrote Playboy, and I also would call these studios. So you're just cold calling constantly.
You cold called Playboy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so were they just one of the people that called you back and said,
They were the only people.
The only people that called you back.
They were the only people that called me back. The studio manager, this guy named Billy, just the nicest guy in the world. And he, I think I beat him down. And because I was leaving him messages. When I was in high school, there was an issue of Playboy with Pamela Anderson. And she was photographed in this kind of like beat up old hotel. That was the photo spread, and some of it's pretty cheesy. It's her with like a saxophone and her on top of the hood of this car. And I remember seeing that in high school and just thinking, this is it. Like the imagery is so beautiful, and most of that was natural light. That is one of the things that really edged me toward Playboy.
Interesting.
Was that, and if you go up in my room right now, that issue is signed by Pam, and it's hanging up on my wall.
It's kind of topical in a way because the show Pam and Tommy that was on Hulu.
Yeah, it was an amazing show.
I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah.
And of the two things about it that were the most kind of revealing, one, like I didn't realize Tommy Lee was like that much of a dick. Like I did not realize. I mean, I guess I knew that he, listen, you're a star for that long,
right?
And whatever. I wasn't aware that he was that abrasive. The other side of it was, while I didn't care what happened to him because I felt like, oh, he'll be fine. She's the one you feel like empathy towards because, yeah, she's just a small town girl that made it big. And for all of her, whatever her faults were, her talent as an actress that she was trying to break out. I mean, this is the last thing you need. And
yeah. And well, and also I'll just say this. I mean, the couple times I met Pam, she was just one of the loveliest people.
That's what everyone
she was so
says.
Sweet.
And so you kind of feel like she's the one that's kind of getting punished for it.
Yeah.
And she did these photo shoots for Playboy.
Uh-huh.
And, and pretty much her career was built around the fact that she was this gorgeous woman. I thought she was more appealing to me as the girl next door than just the va-va-voom kind of girl.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
But, there's no denying the fact that like she was the most beautiful girl in the world. And every guy was like gaga for Pam Anderson. But because she did that, and then these legal troubles came up, now it's like she doesn't have a voice at all, right? Like now,
Right.
just because you showed your body, like no one cares what you have to say. Like you don't have any rights. You've shown us the goods. There's nothing left for you to complain. You have no privacy anymore. And it reminded me of this girl I met in LA many years ago who had been a Perfect 10 model.
Okay.
And she had done a small photo spread for them, which, she never said, oh, here's where you can find my Perfect 10, but you do a little web search and you find it. And I'm like, wow, the photos were fine. I mean, she was much more beautiful in person than she was in the photos. It was fine, but it wasn't like if you met her, she was like a stunner. She was like, you would just go,
Right. There was a charisma there.
so much that
Right.
I would go to lunch with her and we would hang out, and it was like you'd walk into a place and we weren't together. I was just good friends with her. I wanted to, and she was very sweet, and we'd walk in and it was the funniest thing ever because every single guy walking in looks at her and was like, you could just see them going, holy shit. And then they look at me and they're like, what is she doing with this fucking loser? And I didn't look at it like, oh, poor me. I looked at it like, I just love this because I'm not with her, but
there's a perception.
There's a perception. But anyway, subsequently, I mean, she would try and get jobs, and it was tough for her because she said, people would do one Google search and they see, and I thought, oh man, that really sucked because she was quite a bright, intelligent person that had way more to offer than her good looks. But it's really hard to look past that whenever you can't even speak when you see her because she's just so good looking. And what I was thinking about prior to this interview was this idea that nowadays it's different, where it's as though, because there's like OnlyFans where people are attaching this to their Instagram and they're having sex with people and they're charging like a subscription for folks. And they don't think about it like, well, I'm going to fuck people on camera and charge people a subscription. And they don't look at it like, well, this is going to ruin my life for doing it. They look at it like, no, this is who I am. And right. So there's the inhibitions are gone, but the sensitivity is way up, right? So it's like they're showing all of these things, but they're also very sensitive to what anyone would say about it, which I think is something to do with the generation we're in, where before it was people would be like, oh, if I do this, it'll just destroy my career. Like I'm damaged goods if I do it. Now it's just not the case, which I find that really fascinating, where people are really okay with having, it used to be, I don't know about you, but it used to be, certainly from my perspective, was the number one thing that you should never, ever, ever, ever do, film yourself having sex. Like that's like on the master plan, never, ever, ever film yourself having sex. And now...
no, it seems to be pretty normalized at this point.
Yeah, so, and I'm not judging that at all. It's just an interesting observation that nowadays it's not the same. People, I know some people that have OnlyFans accounts, and I'll say, aren't you worried that, and they're like, no. And they don't even have it in their head that it may be a problem. Well, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. But it's just interesting that this. I mean,
hopefully it won't.
Yeah.
I would love to live in a society where sexualization of oneself or just sex in general is not deemed kind of a bad thing.
Right.
I mean, definitely we have a lot of humps to get over when it comes to that. But one thing that I do need to say about the Pam and Tommy thing, her photo shoot was not at all real. Like how that happened really kind of drove me insane.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, it seemed very kind of...
Yeah, it was very different than how the shoots were at Playboy.
And that's something I kind of wanted to talk about too, because, and even the stuff you've done for exhibits, like you're dealing with models who are getting nude on some level, like there's some level of undress.
Well, I mean, first of all, you're working with professionals. Mm-hmm. So, and even if you're not, like, even if I'm shooting someone who's, more of an amateur model, it's never just me and them. I mean, that's very rare. Sometimes, like, I would go somewhere and shoot something for a friend of mine who needed an album cover or whatever. But, when you're dealing with, especially a publication like Playboy, you have a stylist assistant, You have, photography assistants. You usually have like 2. Then you have your makeup artist. Sometimes the producer would fly in because, what I shot for was Playboy.com and what they called the special editions, which was like, I don't know if you remember, they were all pictures. So you had like the book of lingerie or book of nudes or whatever.
None of those really amazing articles?
Yeah, none of those amazing articles. They
that
did
everyone
not
buys
exist.
Playboy for?
Yes. So there is nothing sexy about the actual shoot.
You pull back the curtain and really there's nothing there because you imagine in a way, because here's the thing, and maybe it's a credit to the pictures themselves because, I see I remember some of the pictures you had in one of your shows, and it's obviously very sensual. There's a sexual element to it. There's like a sexual vibe to it. It's not gratuitous or even really explicit, but it's there. So you just automatically assume that like this is a vulnerable moment. How did you get to this? And,
I think that some of that just has to do with how you connect with the person, and that intimacy can be taken as sexuality, or and the other thing is certain models can just turn it on,
right?
And you're just having a conversation, and then they just flip that switch. There was this story about Marilyn Monroe. It was a photographer, reporter was on the subway with her, and they were in New York. And they were riding on the subway, and no one was paying any attention to them. The guy was like, well, how do they not know? And she goes, oh, well, I'm not Marilyn. Right? He's like, well, what do you mean? She's like, watch. And then she kind of turned into her version of Marilyn Monroe, and suddenly everyone's heads turned.
Right.
And, certain models that I've worked with are fully capable of doing that, where it's just time to turn it on. And I think in a way, it's just like being an actor or an actress.
It's a professionalism, isn't it?
Yeah, where you can just flip it on. So, and it's really cool to see.
When I was in Reno and we were making the cooler, it was the first time I had spent an entire time on set while a film was being made, and seeing real professional actors working, and they all have their own different style of doing things. And so there's really no one way to skin a cat, so to speak.
Right.
Like there's like some actors before they're seen, they're just off mumbling to themselves, repeating the line and doing whatever. And then there's other ones that are brooding that you just don't go near because you could tell. And then there's the method actors that are like getting themselves all like amped up to do whatever it is that's in the scene. And, Bill Macy was one of these guys that I was so in awe because they were all good. I mean, don't get me wrong, but just Bill was amazing because what he would do, be in a scene and it would be quite emotional and he would have to be in quite a state to film it. Right. And so you see him do that and then you're like, oh, wow, that's like really, really cool. And then they'll say, cut. You know what? We need to change these lights or we need to turn around. We need to do whatever we need to do. Give us 5 minutes, Bill, will you? And he's like, okay. And he just comes right over. And then he's like, hey, Frankie, what's going on? And then I'm like, aren't you still in this emotional kind of spot? And he's like, no, I'm good. And so then like they go and he's just turns it right back on. And I just was like, holy shit. It's like,
well, and see, that's something I'm not capable of doing.
I'm not capable.
No. And that's why I'm on the other side of the camera.
Yeah. But it is, it's like you definitely can feel the intensity of it and the fact that it feels real, even though, it's, and arguably it is, right? Whenever they do that, they can go back and forth and back and forth. Whereas there's other people where they just approach it differently.
Yeah.
And I think having the access to that, like turning it on and off. There was a great story I heard. I was talking to a writer for Entertainment Weekly a few years ago. I just struck up a conversation with him and he was telling me that he had just gotten back from New Mexico where they were filming Breaking Bad. And it was like the second season of Breaking Bad. And by complete chance, I don't know if you were a fan of that show or watched it. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. My favorite scene of that entire series is in season 2. And it's where Walter White goes to Jesse Pinkman's house because he's dating that woman, that girl who is trying to kind of get him out of the, and she's a heroin addict.
Right.
And so he goes and he sneaks into the house and he's trying to figure out what to do. And then she ODs. And he's standing there and he realizes if I turn her over, won't asphyxiate herself. And he's standing there, and of course he's realizing if I do nothing, she'll die, but it also solves my problem.
Right. Right.
So you see him and he's all emotional because even though he does it, it's killing him. And he just realizes he's crossing this huge emotional line like of his character, right? So that I love that scene, right? It's so amazing. So anyway, that guy, that writer for Entertainment Weekly, he was there while they were shooting that because he was doing a story on Breaking Bad.
Wow.
So he was just kind of standing back, happened to be watching that scene. And of course, I'm like, that's my favorite scene. So I said, tell me. So he starts telling me that they shot it like a bunch of different ways.
Okay.
With different versions of what Walter White does. Like one where he saves her, one where, he turns her over, one, different things. I can't remember all of the different variations, but they shot it a number of times. And every single time they would say, action. Then Bryan Cranston is like emotionally just there. And then cut. And then they do it again and he's there again. And so he's back and forth in that really intense emotional state. He just turns it on and off like a faucet.
Yeah.
And that to me is like, holy shit, what kind of alien are you that you can do that? And so this is the funny story. I mean, of course, I'm telling it like it's my story. It's not. It's this guy's story, but
Okay.
It's so good. He said they were going to change something. They were going to move the camera around or whatever. And so they took a break. And so then Bryan Cranston sat down on the bed, the bed that Jesse and the girl were on. And they got up to do whatever. So he sat down and he saw that the Entertainment Weekly guy was there standing in the background and he knew he was there to interview him or whatever. So he looks at him and he just like pats the bed next to him. He's like, hey, come on, sit down. And so he's like, oh. And so there's, Bryan Cranston's all just, happy, smiley, jokey kind of guy. And he sits down and he's like, yeah. He's like, that was amazing. And he's like, yeah, hey, you want to shoot up? All right. Because all of the gear and everything's all still there. And that's crazy that like this is that people have that ability.
Right.
And I think that's a muscle that I suppose you have to flex a ton of times. Talk about like, the 10,000 hours. But yeah, so I don't know how without a bit of a tangent, but I do. I love stories like that because it's great when somebody's able to have access to some part of their creative self that is way more than what your average person would achieve in their life. But really, for people to say that they're not creative is just ridiculous, right? But I mean, not all of us could ever get to that point where we're able to access that.
Right.
But
well, but I think that comes to kind of, something that we were talking about while you were setting up for this, which is, working past the first idea.
Right.
And taking that and kind of changing it and really just honing your craft, right? Like a lot of the models that I worked with that I was, saying were able to just kind of turn it on. I'm sure they spent hours in front of a mirror. And they've also had tons of photo shoots. And so they know what lighting looks good on them.
Right.
And they know how to position their head or their body to get, the best results for them that they want to show. And, it's the same thing with, people like Cranston, although Cranston's amazing. I mean, he's next level. So.
I think so. I mean, there's other people that are like I said, I watched Bill do it and I've seen other actors where they're able to get to the emotional place, but then it's hard to put it back in the box. Like I think that would be me. I think if I got myself to some emotional wreck type state for a scene, if I was an actor, which I'm not, then it would be, I'd have to take a week or two to try and shove it back down with the rest of my feelings,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so working with Playboy, I think that must have been a great learning experience for you as well, because like
oh man, I was fresh out of school.
Yeah.
I had never been on a professional photo set ever. And, I was still living in Santa Barbara. So I was actually commuting to Santa Monica, which was insane.
Right.
Not getting paid because it was an unpaid internship. I did that for 3 months. I was there for 2 weeks just doing random stuff around the studio until I was allowed on set. You know, they kind of want to make sure you're not like just a super creepy, weird dude. And I mean, it's true. You gotta, you know.
Yeah, you got to pass. You got to pass these tests.
Yeah. So when I finally got on set, just the amount of lights those guys used was, I mean, it was pretty absurd. But yeah, it was cool because it really, I think at the end of the day, it was the best photo school I could have ever gone to. You know, we had so many different lighting challenges that you have to deal with. You know, suddenly you're photographing some flight attendant, so you're on a private plane. So now you have to learn how to light a private plane. Or you're shooting at the mansion, so now you have to learn how to light this huge ass building. And it's just constantly new problems. So we'd be downtown and we'd have to like black out an alleyway.
Right.
And, you know, now we're shooting a Ferrari and they want the, you know, everything wet. And so, you know, after getting all of that down, it's, you know, now I can go into pretty much any scenario and go, okay, well, I've dealt with a variation of this.
Right.
So we can take it and I know where to put the glare off the sunglasses, essentially.
Did you find that once you had done that work for Playboy that people looked at you as a photographer of a certain stripe, or was that like an issue, like they were thinking, oh, he's a Playboy photographer, so that means he's...
Certain people definitely do. It depends. If I talk to people who are like DPs for motion, for the most part, they're like, oh, damn, well, you know, light.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of the reaction I get from them. People who don't know photography very well don't understand the kind of masterclass that Playboy was.
Right.
So they see it as more like, oh, you take naked pictures. And they don't.
Sometimes.
Yeah. But, and, you know, and they can't separate the two.
Yeah.
And the thing is nudity for me doesn't bother me. Male, female, I don't care.
Yeah.
And, you know, I studied abroad for a little bit in Florence and I lived in Italy, and nudity over there is just no thing. You know, we had a billboard outside of our little apartment. It was just a naked woman on a piece of bread, and it was for an ad for butter. And, you know, because you walk down the street and it's just statues and naked people. Right. And so you know, there's this Puritan aspect of things here. And I mean, the fact of the matter is I've done a hell of a lot more than just Playboy. So, you know, at this point in my career, I think you can kind of tell going into something, like if these people are going to be, if this client is going to be receptive to that, or if I even bring it up. Unfortunately, you know, you Google me, it's going to come up. But yeah, I think a lot of time executive producers or people that have been in the industry for a while, they respect it because they know what it actually means. It's not
like you're like doing pictures for Screw magazine or
no,
something.
No,
I mean,
yeah, not at all.
Playboy's the cream of the crop in terms of the quality of the pictures. I mean, some people would say that are really looking for like overly sexed kind of smut. They would say they would avoid Playboy because that's not what that is.
No, and you know, I mean, honestly, if you look at it now, half the crap we shot in Playboy is on Instagram.
Right.
You know, it's barely covered people on Instagram. And like you were saying, I think there's a normalization of it, which I'm all for. I mean, I think shunning the human body is kind of a weird thing in general.
I think there's an interesting movement going on, and I can't really put my finger on the whys and wheres of it, but you know, I started watching the HBO show Euphoria. The amount of male full frontal nudity that is in that show is shocking.
Right.
Not in a bad way per se, but it's just that you're just not, this is like it used to be this line, like you could show female nudity and you could show a guy's ass on camera, but let's keep it at that. And here there is just a complete lack of giving a shit.
Yeah.
And there's something both refreshing about it and a little odd because you're not, you're kind of used to it if you're watching the show. And I think that there's been other shows, like there was a show on HBO called The Deuce, which started to kind of go down that road a little bit more and was a little bit more even-handed about the nudity. And I think ultimately it is a good thing because, like, who cares, right?
Yeah.
But it is one of those things where, like you say, we are a puritanical country.
Right. And that's the thing too, is I'm not also, like, it can be, you know, exploitive, right? Yep. And so there are definite things that you want to, I mean, use common sense when it comes to your judgment on it. But yeah, that was a fantastic way to spend my, mid 20s through my mid 30s was with kind of the Playboy family. And then, from there, I think I burned out a little on photography and ended up going into painting and did that for a while. Really enjoy that. And then, now I'm kind of trying my hand at writing. And, when I was younger, there was this a little bit of a stigma on the jack of all trades, master of none thing. And I, as you get older, you just kind of realize I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want to do.
Oh yeah.
My wife has always said I'm not a photographer. She's always said I'm just an artist that happened to pick up a camera because that solved the problems that I had and told the stories I wanted to tell through that medium. And then it was painting because I wanted to use texture and something that was a little more three-dimensional. And so then I figured out I'm not Dolly, I can't paint like that. But what I wanted to create, I got to the level that I was able to do that. And then with writing, it was kind of the same way, although this was very much a happy accident. And this was really building on what I consider a really crappy idea.
Right.
One of my buddies, his name is Tracy Morris. He's a writer, and he does some films and TV and some other things. And we go out and we have a drink every once in a while. And we met up in 2018, and he said, when you lived back at the lofts, we were out drinking one night and we had like a crazy night, and you told me about this weird dream you had of this bridge and this battle on this bridge. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And I was like, what? And so he started describing it to me. And so I thought about it for like a couple of days, and I came back to him. I was like, I do remember that. And I remember it, but it is a horrible idea for anything. And, it was this essentially these people who were secluded. It was this post-apocalyptic thing. It was so tropey. And he said, well, he's pitching this idea to Netflix for this animated series. And he said he wants to like base it somehow around, this idea of this bridge and this battle on it. So I said, okay, well, let me throw some things together. And, I had helped him write a couple of little shorts and done some other things. And it's always just been fun. And I started going on these long walks, and I would just think about this, and it became this massive thing. So I kind of very typical me, I went very overboard. And I wrote about 300 pages of
Holy
this.
Shit.
Yeah, it was a Bible for this world. And I got down to the economy, and, I broke down the botany of the planet, all of the different, wildlife and all the different characters. And then I broke down what each of these episodes would be. And I did it for like 3 seasons, 10 episodes a season. And so, I brought it to him. We went out and we met for lunch. I plopped this thing down, and he was just like, what the hell? This is not at all what, and I'm not a screenwriter. I had no idea, he just wanted a treatment. He's like, okay, well, let me take it home. So he takes it home, and we meet up like 3 days later. And he said, yeah, you can't do this as an animated series because they'll ruin it. Essentially, he was like, you need to write this as a novel so you have IP. You need intellectual.
Oh yeah.
And so he was like, just write it as a novel. I was like, never written anything. He's like, just do it. You'll be fine. This guy has so much faith in me, which was just baffling. And so I sat down, I started writing, and I think I realized somewhere in that process that it's like, wow, because I'd never written before, right? But it's like, oh shit, just because I write something doesn't mean it's in stone. And so I took it it's kind of like the same way I started painting, where it's like, oh, you're just going to layer it. So I'm going to put my blue down, which is just essentially my outline. And then I'm just going to work on it until, and then I'll go in and detail it when I'm done.
Yeah.
I wrote the first 2 novels, through an edit, kind of realized they were too dense. And so I cut those in half. So, I have my first 4. So, yeah, I just got the copyright of the first one back from the Library of Congress. It's really cool. So they're out with beta readers right now.
well, congratulations. I mean, I love hearing those kind of stories because the truth is most of the time, people will say, oh, you know what? I always wanted to be a writer. I just don't have the time. As if somehow it's just time. All you need is just time.
Right.
And that there isn't a process of putting your thoughts together that, in such a way. And even if they did want to do it, they never do it. And so anytime anybody finishes something, especially a novel, Christ, even a script is amazing. Whether it's good or not doesn't matter insofar as that you've gone through that process.
Yeah.
Like I used to tell people to do, and I used to do the Nanowrimo. Are you familiar with the Nanowrimo?
No, not at all.
Okay, you'll probably like this.
All right.
It's November. It's the National Novel Writing Month, right? And what it is you agree to write a 50,000 word story or novel in the month of November.
Okay.
And so every day you go and write, and then you go onto the website and then you update your word count, right? You don't have to upload the entire thing, but and so you're on your honor to say whether you
right
did it or
if
not.
you're hitting it.
And so I would tell people, say, yeah, you should do this, and they're like, well, what do you get at the end? And I'm like, oh, you get an amazing prize, and they're like, well, what?
You have a novel.
You have a novel. You have a draft.
Yeah.
And I would try to tell people that it's really not about perfection. It's about that you'll realize how creative you are. Because if I said you have to write 2,500 words a day, and you're like, well, I don't know what I'm going to write. It's like pretty soon after you continue to write the words, I don't have an idea. I don't have an idea. This really sucks. This really sucks. I'm hungry. I want to go eat. So eventually you're going to get past all of that chatter, and then you're going to get to the other stuff that's kicking around in the back of your head that you may never get to if you're not forced to sit down and just get the garbage out of the front of your brain so you can get to the other stuff. And when people have done it, and anybody that has gone through the process of writing something like a novel, like they know what that is. They know that once you just start going, some of it just comes out that you have no idea where it came from.
No, it completely takes over.
Right. And you have no sense of like, how did I come to that? Like, how did that work out? Because it proves to you that the part of your unconscious that is thinking about these things is putting the connections together, even though consciously you aren't. So a lot of times you'll go back and read something, and then you'll say, I need a solution to this. And you'll realize that you had put it there all along, but you just didn't understand that it was like part of your subconscious was working it out. And so I love that type of stuff. Kudos to you for actually going through that process, because most people, they don't. And even if you did write one manuscript, it's enough to look at it and go, oh my God, what am I going to do with that? Right. But it's just a great way to express yourself. And that's how I look at it in terms of it is kind of forcing someone to go on a larger scale past the first 100 shitty ideas.
Yes.
And to see what else is there.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also important, which has been with all of my stuff, as far as how it's driven, is I get an idea in my head, and the idea will keep tapping the back of my brain until I make it.
Yeah.
And, so a little bit of it's just like it's an exorcism, and I just need to get it out.
Right.
Because, once it's out, then I can kind of move on to the next thing. But if I don't attend to it, it'll just kind of keep tapping me.
I'm a huge, huge believer in all of this creative exploration, because, one of the things that you were talking about there about, how that your wife says you're not a painter really feeds into my view of the world, which is that I used to think I needed to be just a writer, when in actual fact, it's not that. It's an area of creativity,
right?
Creating things, and that you realize sometimes, because you're forced to, that other things you do feed your soul in the same or similar way. And so what's great about it is that then you're like, oh, wait, I don't have to just do this one thing.
Yeah.
That might be really hard to do, right? Because it might be pie in the sky in terms of success, but there's other things you can do, or an area of creativity that you can do that really pays the dividends. And so I think that that's what I want to try and get people to understand and see, because not everybody has a glamorous, great job. Even the jobs that we think are like, oh, I wish I could do that. Like, there's still work, and they're still using the mind and solving problems, which everybody has to do. So
Yeah.
anyway, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to take the time and talk to me. Again, you have like a lot of insight into your process, which is what is so important, because people are process people. I know I am. I'm like, I want to know, like, how did you do that? How do I do it again? And if that helps people out there, then that's great. So thank you very much for coming. Is there anywhere anyone can go to find anything about you?
No, but there will be soon. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll start. Once this thing kind of goes through its process, I'll start putting it out. And I just say, man, just practice your craft. Make shit.
Make art.
Yep. Do it.
All right. Thanks,
All right.
WB. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. If you enjoyed this content, please do me a favor and like, comment, and share it. Or you can subscribe to this podcast by going to www.bestworstideapodcast.com.